Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom, closing walls and ticking clocks.
And this is episode number 26.
As always, we want to thank you guys for watching, for listening, and for following us on our social media. We're really excited. We have some really fun stuff coming up. We announced the film festival. That's going to be starting in about 2 weeks. I know we've been promising the YouTube page. The first YouTube video is going to be up next week. So that's coming up soon. Keep an eye out for that, and we will add that to our social media as well. And like I said, we have a lot of fun things planned for you over the next few weeks and months.
So today we're talking about something that is very topical right now, and that is daylight savings time. When this episode comes out, we will have just changed the clocks the previous Sunday. So I imagine we're all feeling a little bit of the effects of the clock change this week. So
this seems like a little early than usual this year.
It's actually not. I will get into it. Yeah, it has changed a bit over the years, and I'll give you some reasons behind that. But yeah, it's the second Sunday of March that it's supposed to happen.
So apparently my automatic alarm clock has been lying to me. This son of a bitch.
It has been.
It jumps ahead and falls back like 1 week early than it's supposed to.
Yeah, something's wrong with it. Yeah.
I've had it since 2006, so maybe it's time.
Yeah, because the last change was in 2007. So that explains it. Okay.
I got it at Walmart. It was one of those ones that like you used to be able to, like, you would plug it in and it set itself automatically, that they used to advertise on TV. And like, because the whole thing was, if the power goes out, as soon as it comes back on, you don't have to reset the clock.
Right. Yeah, your clock needs an upgrade. Now, prior to my research, I had a lot of strong feelings about keeping daylight savings time permanent, but I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, and my feelings have changed a bit. So, Tom, what are your feelings about daylight savings time, standard time, the time changes in general? What do you think?
It's dumb. Every couple of years, we go through this little song and dance of, one state or one city or somewhere decides, oh, we're going to vote on daylight savings time, and then nothing happens. It just seems like a tease. Like, just either do it or don't.
There has been so much discussion around daylight savings time and the time changes for so long, and we're going to get into it, but you're not wrong there.
And I know that there are some places that in America that don't follow it, which leads to some really weird like cutouts in the time zones. But yeah, I like it when we spring ahead, because I like the fact that it will not be like pitch black at 5 o'clock. But I also like, gaining the extra hour of sleep.
All right, are you ready to get into it?
Let's rock and roll.
So the first thing that I learned was that the correct wording is daylight saving time, though daylight savings time is often used instead. And that's what I'm going to be referring to it as during this episode. Now, most people know what this is, but for anyone that doesn't, daylight savings time refers to the 2/3 of the year in which the clock is adjusted to allow for more sunlight at the end of the day. Daylight savings time begins in early March and ends with the onset of standard time in early November. Participating countries and states move the clock forward or back 1 hour at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning twice a year. Now, saying it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Like, Sundays at 2 a.m., we change the clocks.
Like, why 2 a.m.? I'm sure there's like a calendar reason, because it I know like there's a whole thing with the calendar, and we actually get like an extra quarter day every year. So that's probably a reason why. But it just seems like 2 a.m. is just like such an arbitrary time to do this.
I thought so too. And I very much wondered why it's Sunday at 2 a.m., but I found that answer and I will share that with you in just a bit. So every year we do this, and every time we grumble and groan and ask, why the fuck are we doing this? Well, some of us do it. Daylight savings time occurs in 70 countries around the world, so about 35% of the world does this. And participation in daylight savings time hours by country has varied over the years. It is practiced in most of North America, parts of Europe, Australia, and the Middle East. And only a few parts of South America, Africa, and Asia practice it or used to practice it. Countries that had control over other countries enforced their own daylight savings time practices, and as these countries gained independence, many of them abandoned it. Daylight savings time is also referred to as daylight time in the US and Canada and parts of Australia, and it's just called summertime in the UK and European Union.
It's, summertime and the living's easy.
Now, where a lot of these countries fall back by turning the clock back 1 hour in the fall and spring forward an hour in late winter, Chile, Paraguay, New Zealand, and parts of Australia fall forward and spring back. So I know you mentioned this, that you kind of prefer spring forward, but to me, it's kind of a catch-22 because in the fall, you gain an extra hour, but you descend into like this early darkness for a few months. And then in the spring, you lose an hour, but then you jump ahead and there's so much more daylight at the end of the day. So it's really just kind of like weighing the immediate effects of the time change versus, the long-term effects of it. So you prefer spring forward?
I like the sunlight. When it is 5 o'clock and it's dark out, especially once the holidays are over, that gets very depressing to me. Very, very depressing. So I like gaining the sunlight. I mean, it sounds stupid to say. I live with losing the hour of sleep, knowing that it's going to be brighter out. And also, too, by that point, that summer's coming. I tend to really like summer.
Has your feelings changed at all over the years?
You know what? I think I notice it more as I've gotten older. When I was a kid, it didn't, what kids can really get to think about that anyway. I know when I was a kid, it didn't faze me one way or the other. I didn't really have a strong opinion on it. I think when I started working and I started going to an office and then you would look outside and it's, 5 o'clock at night and it's pitch black, you're like, that's kind of depressing.
And I think you're right about that, because the same for me. Like, I didn't really notice any effects either way until I was a working adult, and then I seemed to care a little bit more. And I guess when I was younger, I really, like I said before in other episodes, I'm a night owl, so gaining an extra hour was just the best. But now I would rather jump ahead to more daylight. It's just losing the hour. It can really affect me, and just it can take days for me to kind of come out of it. It feels like such a brain fog,
That's a good way of putting it. I tell the story that when I first started working, I remember I started in August, and after about 2 months when the calendar switched over, I think the first day after, I was sitting in my office and I just happened to look out my window and it was 4:45 and it was pitch black outside. It was a mind fuck. It was, how long have I been here? What am I doing? And I looked at the clock and it was only 4:45. I'm like, oh my, it threw me for a bit of a loop.
Adulting.
Yeah, really.
Now, there are parts of the world, such as the Arctic and Antarctic circles, and countries around the equator, where transitioning to daylight savings time just doesn't make any sense. The Arctic and Antarctic circles see both full days of sun or darkness, so shifting the time 1 hour in either direction would literally make no difference. Some research stations, however, in these locations will adjust their time to stay in sync with the country that's sponsoring them. So I thought that was interesting. Countries near the equator do not change their clocks either, because the sunrise and sunset times do not vary enough to justify it. Did you know that?
I did not. I knew about Alaska and, the endless sunlight during the summertime, but I did not know about that.
Yeah, that surprised me too, but honestly, it makes sense.
No, it does.
Now, let's get into the history of daylight savings and how we got to where we are today. Our story begins in the late 1700s with Benjamin Franklin in Paris, France. In a time before widespread electricity, people used candles that were quite expensive and dangerous. Do you remember in our Christmas minisode how we talked about how people used to put candles on their Christmas trees, and that just freaked me the fuck out?
Well, because it's weird and also a fire hazard.
Very much so, yeah.
Like you're putting candles on something that burns quite easily in your house.
So it was the same problem here. A lot of people were setting their houses on fire, and it was just not a good situation. So, because it was dangerous, Ben Franklin suggested that people could cut their candle usage by waking up earlier and taking advantage of more of the sunlight, leading to his famous phrase, quote, "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise."
And also keeps their house from going up like a Roman candle.
Yeah. Though he never actually suggested a clock change, no one took him seriously at the time and everybody moved on.
They were stuck in their house burning ways, and dadgummit, they were gonna, no one was gonna tell them not to burn their houses down.
I don't know if it was they thought it was just a ridiculous idea, which is kind of what I got from the research, or they really just didn't want to change. I'm not really sure.
I mean, there is something kind of very, and I know we're talking about France, but there is something very American in the houses are burning down because people are playing with candles. Instead of doing something about the candles, we will literally alter the clocks so that we can continue to use candles and potentially burn our houses down.
Yeah, it doesn't really solve the issue, does it? A couple of decades later, in 1810, Spain issued a regulation that moved meeting times and business hours to accommodate more sunlight, but they also never suggested or required a clock change. Fast forward to the late 1800s, where the Industrial Revolution was roaring in the US, and railroads were the main form of transportation for both people and goods. It quickly became apparent that there was no standard railroad time, leading to a lot of confusion and a lot of missed trains. They weren't quite sure what to do about it or how to standardize the time, though. In 1884, President Chester Arthur hosted a convention with numerous other countries where they discussed similar issues in creating a standard time for regions in their countries. This led to the establishment of the international time zones. The desire to extend daylight hours during the warmer months didn't go away, though. Around the turn of the century, entomologist George Hudson suggested shifting the clock 2 hours in the summertime so he had more time to look at bugs. He was a big bug guy, being an entomologist, and it was funny to me because the documentary that I watched that mentioned that said it was kind of selfish because he was just focused on his needs and what he wanted to do, not necessarily, the benefit for everybody, but yeah.
God bless America. So now we have on record, we're setting times A, so people can potentially not burn their houses down, and B, so that one dude can look at bugs.
Yeah, essentially.
We are a prosperous country, allegedly.
Also around this time, a man named William Willett proposed a clock change in the UK. He loved summer so much and wanted more hours during the day that he suggested several 80-minute time changes in the month of April. While he did get some support, many people were annoyed about having to change their clock numerous times and argued that time zones were still a newer concept in the world and everybody was still adjusting to it, so why throw another wrench into this? Which I kind of get that.
That's the first logic we've seen from anyone in this story so far.
By 1908, Port Arthur, Canada, was the first city to institute daylight savings time with an official clock change. The first country to do so was the German Empire, and then soon after, Austria-Hungary in 1916 in the middle of World War I. 2 years later, daylight savings time was first implemented in the United States with the Standard Time Act of 1918. It was used as a wartime measure for 7 months during World War I in the interest of adding more daylight hours to conserve energy resources, extend the workday by 1 hour, and allow for more time to attend to victory gardens.
So first, if my history is right, and I think it is, we changed clocks before we allowed women to vote.
Accurate.
I just want to make sure we have our priorities, We now have also changed clocks for gardening, bugs, candles, and working.
Well, technically, they didn't change the clocks due to the candles and the bugs, but the gardens and the working, yes. But you have to remember at this time what the country looked like during World War I, that, a lot of the men were overseas and fighting, and they needed the extra hour at work to make sure that things were getting done and things were getting produced and manufactured, and the importance of victory gardens and producing food back then. So I understand it. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I get in wartime, especially this war, yeah, I understand it to some degree.
Well, yeah, I get it, but it's just, again, for gardens.
So something that I came across in my research was these really old advertisements that feature like Uncle Sam and are very kind of wartime, I guess, themed, and basically kind of touting daylight savings time. I want to show you a couple of these. So here's the first one. See Uncle Sam?
One thing I will say is, at least from what you're showing me, there are no racial slurs, so I appreciate that. That already does better than like half of the war propaganda from World War I and II.
So it's essentially Uncle Sam shoveling a bunch of coal with a little guy with a clock as a face, just kind of touting the benefits of daylight savings time. And then the other one I want to show you, purely just for the tagline at the bottom. It's also a very old school one. It's Uncle Sam. Can you read everybody what the line at the bottom says?
At the top, it says victory. At the bottom, it just says in big giant quotes, "Get your hoe ready."
So it's essentially referring to the push to have people spend more time on their victory gardens. But when I first saw that, it was like, oh, okay, get your hoe ready. So as you can imagine, it was largely unpopular and abandoned after the war, but not for a lack of effort to keep it. Daylight clubs, as they were called, popped up around the country, where manufacturing tycoons, labor unions, as well as baseball teams lobbied to convince President Woodrow Wilson to keep daylight savings time as a federal law in their own self-interest. Being a golf enthusiast himself, he saw the value in extending the daylight hours, and he twice vetoed an attempted repeal of the law. His second veto was overruled, and the law was repealed in 1919. A huge myth around daylight savings time is that farmers wanted it and benefited from it, but the contrary is actually true. Now, I'm sure you've heard the big argument that this started because of farmers and, this was going to make their lives easier. They could tend to the crops. Like, you've heard that, right?
Well, and the ones I always heard were farmers and trains.
Trains is accurate, yes.
Those were always the two reasons I was always told why we have daylight saving time, was because of farmers somehow and because of trains with, well, I guess that would also be more time zones than it would be daylight savings time.
Well, like I said, I think the daylight savings time, it also got a little wonky. Once it was in place and certain cities and states participated or didn't, it really got messed up. Like I said, Farmers did not want this, nor did they benefit from it. Most farmers strongly opposed the change to daylight savings time and always have, citing a disruption to their farming schedules. The time of the morning dew and the cow's readiness to be milked are dictated by the sun, not the clock. And cows don't care what time it is. The time changes with daylight savings time presented unnecessary challenges to farmers, which made their lives harder.
I'm just going to say the cow's not going to care what time it is. The cow's only worried about one thing.
Now, farmers are said to have had a hand in lobbying for the Standard Time Act of 1918 to be repealed, and it eventually was. Now, between World War I and World War II, some countries kept daylight savings time while others didn't. Winston Churchill was a supporter of it, saying, "It broadens the opportunities for the pursuit of health and happiness among the millions of people who live in this country," referring to the UK. So, in my research, it really seemed apparent that the UK feels very strongly about daylight savings time, and from what I gather, they're the one country that's kept most consistent with it over the years.
Well, and the UK also has a history of just, once they decide they're going down a road, that's it.
Now, when World War II broke out, the US decided to reinstate daylight savings time from 1942 to 1945, citing the same reasons as before: energy savings and longer workdays. Several countries brought daylight savings time back around this time as well. After the war, states were given the option to go back to practicing standard time all year, and most did.
Okay, so question, because you talked about the U.S. reinstating it during World War II. Did you see anything about whether Germany or Japan or Italy had reinstated it during this time? Because you would think if America's doing it for the war effort, you would think the other side's doing that too.
I can't say definitively, but what I can tell you is it very much felt around the world internationally that this was at least a wartime effort. Without knowing for sure, my guess is yes, that they reinstated this as well.
It is wild to think that that's the one thing the world agreed on at that point.
Right?
Was reinstating daylight savings time.
By the 1960s, there was a lot of confusion due to the lack of consistency in the use of daylight savings time around the country, leading to a lot of problems with travel. There was also capitalism. Retailers, restaurant owners, and golfers all lobbied to bring back daylight savings time, and in 1966, they got their wish. President Lyndon Johnson enacted the Uniform Time Act, which legally required states to choose permanent standard time or seasonal daylight savings time on unified clock change dates. Most states opted in for a seasonal daylight savings time, with a few exceptions. Hawaii and Arizona have always had permanent standard time, and most of Indiana had permanent standard time until 2007. Hawaii does not get enough variation in the amount of daylight that they receive, and Arizona did not want to extend their very hot days during the summer. I don't blame them at all. Indiana's decision to switch for most of the state came from the urging of its own residents. Did you know that Hawaii and Arizona have never had it?
I know Arizona doesn't. I know Arizona has a history of not adopting federal things. Like, I think they were the last state to observe Martin Luther King Day, and that was like in 1995. Because it was basically a whole thing of like the NFL wasn't going to let them have a Super Bowl if they continued to not observe it. But I get the reasons why Arizona would not. It makes sense. The Indiana one just is weird. But if that's what the people want, if that's how the votes were, then that's how the votes were.
I was surprised at Indiana. Yeah, I agree with you.
It doesn't seem like it benefits anybody one way or the other.
By the 1970s, many people wanted to extend daylight savings time all year. So evenings would permanently have a little bit of extra light, and it had a whopping 79% support for it. At the time, there was also a growing oil crisis and increasingly scarce energy resources. So, our listeners that were around in the 70s would remember the gas lines and only being allowed to get gas on certain days based on what the numbers on your license plate were as a conservation measure. So, this was a real thing in the 70s. So, it seemed like a win win for everybody, right? Everybody wanted longer daylight at night, and they needed to deal with the oil crisis. President Nixon enacted permanent daylight savings time starting in the winter of 1974. But by February, support for permanent daylight savings time dropped to just 42%. People didn't love starting their workdays in the dark, and there were safety concerns about children walking to school in the dark. By October of 1974, President Ford reversed the law and daylight savings time went back to a seasonal practice. Now, there have been a few slight changes to daylight savings time since then. In 1986, daylight savings time was extended from 6 to 7 months of the year, and in 2005, the Energy Policy Act extended it again to 8 months, how we know it today, lasting from the second Sunday in March to the first Sunday in November, starting in 2007. So, Tom, do you have any guesses on why they extended daylight savings time to 8 months in 2005?
I'm going to say it's something like relating to commuting or or something like that, because that would be something that would annoy me.
That is a good guess, but it was actually the candy companies. So prior to this change, daylight savings time ended before Halloween, limiting the daylight that kids had to trick or treat. So, in an effort to extend Halloween and increase candy sales, they quietly lobbied for the extension and won. No one was really upset about it, though, honestly.
No, but it's, dystopia presented by Hershey.
You didn't expect it to be the candy companies, did you?
No, and now that I know that, I'm glad you warned me. It was stupid.
Yep. I read it and I'm like, oh, that's real dumb, but that tracks. Yeah.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the last attempt to change the rules around daylight savings time, though. Now, of course, the problem in the United States is that under the current law, any state can adopt permanent standard time, but Congress is needed to enact a change to permanent daylight savings time. So it's either permanent standard time, seasonal daylight savings time, or nothing else. In 2018, Florida Senator Marco Rubio introduced the Sunshine Protection Act to make daylight savings time permanent again. After a few iterations of the bill in the years that followed, it passed the Senate unanimously in March of 2022 with a lot of public support behind it. It received a ton of media coverage as the senators congratulated themselves on the bipartisan agreement and touted the bill as, quote, sunshine, smiles, and savings. There is one problem with the bill, though. It doesn't actually protect the sunshine. The same amount of sun exists regardless of any time change. It's just a shift in hours. So it doesn't quite make sense the way they phrase it.
Oh, Marco's at it again.
Now, the Sunshine Protection Act was sent to the House of Representatives, but stalled because they can't agree on keeping permanent daylight savings time or permanent standard time. So it's kind of died there. Many other countries have tried to make daylight savings time permanent over the years, but it never seems to stick. Russia, for example, spent a lot of the Soviet era in permanent daylight savings time, but it didn't last. They tried it again in 2011, but it only lasted 3 years until 2014. Most recently, the European Union ended the mandatory change to daylight savings time in 2021, allowing countries to choose either permanent daylight savings time or standard time or a seasonal change. So you kind of alluded to this in the beginning, but Another question I had in my research was, why do we change the clocks at 2 a.m. on a Sunday? Do you have any more thoughts before I tell you the reason?
Is the reason stupid?
Yes and no.
I'm going to guess it's something relating to, because I know it, like how we have, like, the actual year is like 360.25 days. And that's why, we have a leap year every 4 years. My guess is it's something related to that.
It's not that. It's because of railroads. So, when daylight savings time was first introduced during World War I, 2 a.m. was one of the very few times that there were no trains running across the country. They decided to change the clocks on a Sunday in order to reduce any disruption to weekday schedules. So it kind of makes sense, but it also now seems antiquated a bit based on something that was started during World War I. You know what I mean?
That does make sense. It's just I don't like when corporations are the ones that when people's lives are affected, because it makes it easier on multinational corporations, but go off, kings. Go off, business kings.
There is a lot more of that behind this than I even imagined. And it's not surprising, but it's just...
No, it's how the world works, unfortunately.
Now that we know the history of daylight savings time, let's talk about some of the implications of the time changes. Of course, daylight savings time changes affects some people more than others. The most obvious one being the disruption to the circadian rhythm. Even a 1 hour difference, both gaining and losing, throws off the natural chemical and cellular cycles of when we are awake and asleep. Entering daylight savings time and losing an hour of the day causes sleep deprivation. And it's been equating to like a feeling of jet lag, or kind of how I said in the beginning, to me, it feels more like brain fog.
That day after, you're in another planet.
Agreed, yeah. It can take some people days to weeks to get back on their normal circadian rhythm. One documentary that I watched talked about how Chernobyl, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, as well as the Challenger disaster are all partially linked to inefficient sleep and a disruption in circadian rhythms of those that were involved. So this can be more dangerous than people think. Some studies also show an increase in mood disturbance and cardiac events, and it's thought to contribute to about 30 deaths per year. Time changes can also affect work or school performance, the ability to respond to stress, and can contribute to procrastination, which I don't necessarily buy that one, but yeah, sure.
I think the procrastination train has left the station.
I think that's more inherent to the person than the time change, but
I mean, I would agree, but I also agree that that's a tomorrow me problem.
Now, the time changes also face opposition from both the medical and scientific communities. In recent years, we've heard that the time change, particularly to daylight savings time in the spring, causes an increase in traffic accidents and work-related injuries in the week after the time change. Traffic accidents are attributed to sleep deprivation and driving to work in the dark. The data is a bit mixed, though. While these accidents in the US and the UK increase slightly, there is no change in traffic accidents in Finland or Sweden. So where's the explanation to that? Are they just better drivers in Finland and Sweden? You know what I mean?
Well, I think yes, for one. I would like to see a more thorough study on that, because that's interesting.
It is. I kind of want to know why there's no effect in those countries.
I would like to see a more thorough study on that, because that seems very, places like Sweden, Finland, Alaska, they have it where parts of the year it's permanent sunlight and other parts of the year where it's permanent darkness. So, when you have those extremes, I would like to see why those extremes don't really do anything, but the extra hour causes absolute chaos, on interstates all over America.
Well, maybe because they're used to driving in the dark. Now that you say that, maybe it's not as big of an adjustment for them than it is in the States, you know?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's also probably other reasons too. Like, I don't know, you know, you didn't get me into a rant about pickup trucks and cars with 18 headlights they're glaring right in your eyes at the same time. There's a lot of factors we don't know. I'd like to see a study with a very well-defined scope and parameter before I make any sweeping judgments based on the result.
Now, there wasn't a ton of information on workplace injuries after the time change either, except for one OSHA statistic that says that workplace injuries increased by 6% in the week following the time change. Transportation planning and schedules also need to be adjusted during the time changes. Routes of buses, trains, and air travel need to be shifted and aligned with other cities, states, and countries that may or may not participate in daylight savings time. The cost of aligning the routes internationally is at an estimated cost of $100 million per year. That's pretty pricey.
That's a lot. You wouldn't think you wouldn't think it would cost that much, but I guess it does.
Mm-hmm. I really never thought about the logistics of everything that goes into the time change twice a year. And it's a lot more than anybody thinks that it is, honestly.
I never even thought of the logistics. I just thought of the change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Me too. Remember the argument since the inception of daylight savings time that more sunlight equates to less energy usage? Well, turns out that the savings is marginal at best, saving an average of 0.3%, according to a study from 2017. Energy saving is complicated in the modern age as energy patterns keep shifting with increased use of technology and people spending less time outside in general. So, to me, there's just too many confounding variables to get like an accurate statistic on that. But I do agree it probably doesn't save much, if any, energy at all.
No, because you have certain things that consume whatever you're saving and then some 10 times over.
Now, it has been shown, however, that gas usage actually increases after switching to daylight savings time, which makes sense because more people are out and about doing activities, stuff like that. So, in that regard, no, it actually costs more in gasoline. Now, speaking of the advancement and increased usage of technology, as the internet was becoming more of a thing, computer coding and time adjustments took a bit of time to catch up. Accurately coordinating time zones and daylight savings time clock changes are crucial to both transportation, as we talked about, as well as the national economy. Experts agree that it would be easier and more cost-effective for all locations to practice the same daylight savings time change, whatever it may be, especially nationally. The global impact of a technology error related to the daylight savings time change could be catastrophic, with some people equating it to a Y2K style disaster. So, a throwback to our Y2K episode.
Those decimal points, they are important.
Now, any parent knows that adjusting times can be really difficult for small kids and their schedules as well, and it can take weeks for kids to adjust to the time change. As mentioned, one of the main arguments against permanent daylight savings time is that children would be walking to the bus or going to school in the dark, which poses safety concerns. It's often cited as one of the number one reasons of why we don't switch to permanent daylight savings time. Pet owners also know that their animals don't understand or don't care about the time changes either. They want to be fed and walked according to their normal schedules, and they will certainly let you know. It can be quite annoying to get up earlier to meet their needs until they slowly adjust to the new time. Some people have opposed daylight savings time for religious reasons. Those that practice the Muslim and Jewish religions, in particular, say that the time changes can make religious practices such as prayer and fasting more difficult or inconvenient. Now, because of this, some countries temporarily abandon daylight savings time during a religious holiday, which I had no idea was a thing.
I don't know how you would make that work though, so it doesn't apply for 1 week and then it goes right back.
Yes.
Like that would seem like it's really effing you up.
Well, yeah. But I think for those countries and those religions, it makes more sense to be able to honor those traditions than the clock necessarily. So I
Of
understand.
course. Yeah, that I get.
So in general, the annual clock changes are quite unpopular and tend to annoy people quite a bit who live in an area that observe these changes. The manual changing of all the clocks twice a year on our microwaves and our cars, our alarm clocks, is certainly a nuisance, but they're honestly becoming increasingly more automatic. Now, there are a few pros to daylight savings time that supporters of a permanent change point to. First, it can provide positive psychological effects by reducing the seasonal affective disorder that some people experience during the wintertime. And people do tend to spend more time outside during daylight savings time. Though daylight savings time causes more traffic accidents in the morning, it actually reduces traffic accidents during the evening commute with the longer daylight hours. So honestly, you're just exchanging one for the other.
Unless you live in a part of the country where a highway was built literally right in the path of the sun in the morning and right in the path of the sun in the evening, for hypothetically.
A 2015 study also found that there's actually a decrease in crime during the first week of daylight savings time. The thought is that criminals prefer to operate at night, and adding more daylight hours in the evening deters them from committing crime until after the sun sets in the later hours. Permanent daylight savings time also has a lot of support from businesses because, again, capitalism. With more daylight in the evening, there's time for more outdoor activities, tourist activities, and dining out. And these business owners welcome the opportunity to make more money, and they have all lobbied to expand daylight savings time. Seasonal daylight savings time brings in $500 million for the golfing industry alone. How crazy is that? That's insane. There is one industry that is thought to be driven out of business because of the practice of daylight savings time, at least in part. Any guesses on what that is?
I do not. What is it?
So it's actually the drive-in movie theaters. So they took a hit when seasonal daylight savings time became a thing in the 60s and 70s. Now, of course, they can't operate during daylight hours, and with the sun setting later and later, it left less time to show their movies, particularly in summertime when the drive-ins were more frequented. Which kind of makes me sad because we actually do have one. I don't remember what town it's in, but it's not far from us. And it's a really cool thing. It's kind of like a throwback to the old days, and it's just a really cool thing, to go and do. But obviously there's not a ton of them around the country. It's not the norm anymore, obviously. And it just makes me sad that something like this, in part, kind of drove that out of business,
Yeah, at the same time, I mean, I went to one and it was fun. I think it was the second Lord of the Rings. I couldn't tell you what happened in the movie. I fell asleep 5 minutes into it. But I also kind of wonder, though, if that just hastened the downfall of drive-ins more than it actually brought it on. Because I think by the time this comes into play, drive-ins are already starting to decline. They're already starting to have problems, I would think.
Yeah, like I said, I think this was in part due to that. But yeah, it certainly didn't help it. Many experts argue to keep standard time permanent and discontinue daylight savings time. They say that standard time is more closely aligned with our circadian rhythms and the rising and setting of the sun. It's also more natural to have more sunlight in the morning and wake up with the sun rather to have more sunlight in the evening, despite the positive psychological effects that some people may feel with daylight savings time. Now, most people are in favor of doing away with the twice yearly clock changes, but a lot of people are split on whether to keep permanent standard time or daylight savings time. And I think, like myself, a lot of supporters of permanent daylight savings time aren't really fully thinking through the effect this would have on like our daily lives in the morning. It is recommended to the extent that we can control it, that it's more beneficial to change our own patterns and schedules if possible with the sun rather than changing the clocks. And I can't really say that I disagree. Now, after all, how we keep time is a human construct, so it's essentially made up. So what we do with it and how we measure it is really up to us.
Welcome to Whose Time Is It Anyway, where everything is made up and the clocks don't matter.
So some discussion points before we wrap it up. So the first thing I thought when Congress tried to bring back permanent daylight savings time is we really do just repeat our mistakes in this country, don't we? Like, it didn't work in the 70s. It took 2 months for people to realize that they absolutely hated it. And now we're going to try it again. It just seems so dumb.
What I would just say is get to one thing and stick with it.
Yeah, agreed.
Either you go to permanent daylight time or you go to permanent standard time, or you just stay where we are and just stay with it.
And I have to say, too, before this, I was very much on that train of, yeah, let's do permanent daylight savings time. But I think after learning some of this and kind of where it started, where it came from, a lot of the lies around it, it's, I don't know. I'm definitely more torn than I was before. Now, what do you think about the health effects and like which is worse? Like both the seasonal change to daylight savings time and permanent daylight savings time both have effects. So like they do say having the sunlight in the morning is better, but like what do you think?
I think it would be more disconcerting getting up in darkness. When you're getting up and it's dark, that's very discombobulating.
And that's the argument that a lot of experts make, that it's unnatural for us to be getting up in the dark.
It's why people have such a hard time doing night shift or working a third shift. Like, it's very hard. Like, if you haven't been doing it your whole life, it's very, very hard to transition to it because it's a complete upheaval of your rhythm. I would prefer getting up in light because when it's dark and you're getting up, you're all over the place.
Do you value that over having a couple extra hours of daylight at night? I know how you feel about it, and I know how much you like having extra sunlight at the end of the day.
I mean, if we're talking about like the difference between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, it's not a huge difference. If we're talking about 5 to 7 or 6 to 8, yeah, that's a little bit different. But when it's 4 o'clock in the morning or when it's 6 o'clock in the morning, you get up and it's pitch black and you now have to fumble around to get dressed and to go to work. You are not yourself. That is when accidents happen. That's where things go wrong because you are still half asleep.
So as we talked about throughout this episode, I really think that the lack of uniformity like really throws a wrench into things. And I understand why, like the European Union, how they want to give countries the choice on what to do with daylight savings time. But I think not having it uniform, not being all on the same page, like that just creates more of a mess. And it's like, to me at this point, whether it was well-intentioned or not at the inception of this, like it's just become an absolute clusterfuck and nobody likes it.
Well, that's when there has to be, and Lord knows there's much more important things going on in the world than daylight savings time. But that's when, you just kind of have to get to, there's got to be agreement of we're all going to do this or we're all not going to do this. Or we're all going to do the same thing. Because for some states or some cities to do it and the rest of the country doesn't, it causes all sorts of chaos. That's really the best word for it, chaos.
And I think everybody can agree that the time changes need to stop, but we need to figure out, are we going to go to permanent daylight savings or stay on permanent standard? And once we figure that out, I think we'll be good. But yeah, I think the consensus is the time change just sucks.
It does. I'm already preparing that Sunday is going to be not great.
So, my last question for you is, did any of this information change your thought on daylight savings, the time change, anything like that?
I definitely am looking at it from a more nuanced perspective now, because I do like increased sunlight at night, but I also like being able to wake up when it's light out, when it feels normal, and not be completely discombobulated and walking around like a zombie. That doesn't do any good to anybody, especially me, because that's when I tend to walk right face first in the doors.
I completely agree with your sentiment there and feel the same way. Although I don't typically walk into doors, but you know.
Well, la-di-da, look at you from your ivory non-walking into door and completely non-burned out house castle.
I mean, no, this podcast is nothing if we don't try to bring nuance to topics, and we hope that we did that for you guys as well for this episode.
Tell us what you think.
Tell us what you guys think. Do you prefer daylight savings time? Do you want the time change to go away completely? Would you be okay with permanent standard time? Yeah, tell us what you think. Are you struggling this week, with losing an hour? I know it tends to be a rough week for everybody when we spring forward. Okay, everybody, that is our show. Tune in next week for another episode from Tom. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the Tell Me About podcast. Please share it with your family and friends. We want to continue to grow our little community here. We're very excited. Each week we continue to get, a few more listeners. So please share that with people you know. And send us comments and episode suggestions to the Tell Me About podcast at gmail.com.
Just remember, guys, coming up, I'll have my episode next week. And then in 2 weeks, the first entry into the Tell Me About podcast film festival. We'll have some fanfare. We'll have the giant spotlights going behind us as we do this. We're not going to tell you the movie. You'll just have to wait until March 27th to find out what the movie is. But it's a movie I'm sure you love. It's a movie I've never seen before.
It is a good one. I'll tell you now. It's a good movie.
I may even dress up in a tuxedo for the occasion. Very, very black tie, very classy, with a red carpet and press junket. It's going to be fun.
See you next week, everybody.
Bye.